This is Research Like a Pro, Episode 23, United States Probate Records, Part 1. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist's Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Research Like a Pro today. I'm Nicole.
And I'm Diana. Welcome.
We are excited today to talk about probate records. We're actually going to be doing this in 2 parts because we had so much information that we wanted to share with you. And we also decided to give you guys a freebie because it's the holiday season and we wanted to give you a present. So we created a cheat sheet all about probate records in the United States. And you can download that free cheat sheet at the following URL, familylocket.lpages.co/probate. And don't worry, you don't have to memorize that. It will be in the show notes. So you can go there and you can download a freebie called our probate cheat sheet. All right, so today we're starting off with a review by Sherry. And Sherry has been one of our biggest supporters of the podcast and the Research Like a Pro book and method ever since she signed up for the study group. We interviewed her a couple of podcast episodes ago, and I wanted to read a couple of her comments and reviews. So first of all, she said, "Thank you for the honor of interviewing me. I loved the course and tell everyone about it every chance I get. It has made a real difference in my research process and in my confidence level. And Diana is a great teacher. She stretches you to your limits and encourages you to experiment. She brought out the best in all of us in the study group, which enabled us to enhance the experience of each other. It was a wonderful experience. I plan to join another study group when I have some more time to devote to my project." And I am looking forward to that because it was fun to learn from her in the study group. Also, she was one of our first people to give us a review of the podcast. This is what she said back in August. "Diana and Nicole are a mother-daughter team that have a great way of making you feel like they are right there in your home just chatting, except they are teaching you to take your research to the next level. After listening to them, you'll want them to be your new best friends." Well, thank you, Sherry. We really think of you as one of our best friends, so it's mutual. Then the last comment that she has here says, "I love podcasts and I love your RLP process. This is a sure win in my book. I've listened to all 4 episodes already and subscribed to the podcast. Found it in iTunes. Yay. It is now in my regular playlist. Thank you for doing this. I love listening to it, and I think I'll get something out of your process every time I read and or listen to it." So we thank you, Sherry, for being one of our biggest fans, and we really appreciate you coming on our podcast to be interviewed. We want to do another interview like that in the future so that we can highlight some more of our study group and eCourse members. And we heard from our listeners that it was a popular episode. So if you haven't heard that one, go back and listen to that. All right, Diana, tell us what we're talking about and why it's important.
Well, today we are going to talk about probate records, and we have talked a lot about the process of researching, but we haven't talked a lot about specific records except for just here and there. And so we thought it would be really helpful for all of our listeners to go through the basic record types and explain why you would even want to research them in the first place, what you can find in them, how to find them, and then how to use the information in the records. Because the records are the foundation of our genealogy research. And so if we don't know much about the records, we're not going to make as much progress as we could. So today we're going to do probate, and you might say, probate, that sounds so scary and so hard. I don't know what to do with that or even how to find it. So we're hoping to demystify that for you today. And I love using probate, and I use it in my client work all the time. It's one of the very first things I always check. So we're going to help you to understand why probate might be a missing piece in your research.
All right, let's dive into the basics of a probate record. What is it? And kind of describe it. So most people are familiar with using wills, and that's part of a probate record, a will that was recorded in the probate court book or other things. Different things that could be included in a probate record are estate division papers, the administration papers, the final settlements. There are all kinds of papers that you'll find, receipts, payments of debts, a list of debts, inventories. There are so many papers that you can find in a probate record. The reason we love them and why they're so helpful is there is a really high chance that you will find genealogical information in one of those papers or several of those papers. So you may be wondering, well, what if my ancestor didn't leave a will? Well, about 25% of the population left a will, but 50% of the population are mentioned in a will. So if your ancestor didn't leave a will, maybe they were mentioned in the will of an uncle or a father, cousin, or friend or neighbor that could give you helpful information. So tell us more about why we would research in probate records, Diana.
It used to be kind of difficult to research probate records. You maybe would have to go to the family history library to look at microfilm or go to the county courthouse and go through all the books there. But because of digitization, a lot of them are now online on your computer. And Ancestry actually has done an index for the main person. And we're going to talk more about how to find that. Even if it's not a complete index of everybody in all the probate, having just the main person is a huge, huge thing. And that's at Ancestry. And then FamilySearch has recognized the importance of probate records and has pretty much digitized all of their collection, and they have that available online. And if you can't find it from your computer, then you may have to go to a family history center in case that record collection is locked. And because of copyright issues, they can't have that be available on everybody's home computer. But much quicker to go to a family history center than the family history library or to that county courthouse. So they're just so much easier to find now. And when we are looking at our sources, we really want to think about how good of evidence is coming out of those sources. And original probate records that were created at the time of an individual's passing are among the best. So if an individual has gone into the county courthouse and they're proving the will on a certain date, you can almost bet that the person died maybe a week or two or even a day before. We don't always have the date of death in the probate. Sometimes you do, but you can tell that the date of death was pretty close to when that will was proven in court. So it's really good evidence. You're also going to have obviously a man or a woman naming their children in the will. Sometimes they will directly say son or daughter, and that's fabulous evidence, especially when we are talking pre-1880 censuses, when people start putting relationships in the censuses. You may not get any other record that states a relationship, and so that can be great direct evidence. But also, I use a lot of probate for indirect evidence. Not everybody left a will where they name people. And so we can get so many clues out of probate. And we're going to talk a lot about that in this episode. So, what can you find in a probate record? Like I said, you might find a death date or you might not. You will definitely get names of family members. You'll get relationships. You often get the names of spouses of the daughters, because often they will name a daughter by her married name or even grandchildren. And then you can figure out who a daughter might have married because you've got a grandchild with a different surname. So many clues. Sometimes you get a residence because they'll talk about people and then they'll say of Texas, and maybe this was an Alabama will, and then you know where they've moved to, which is fabulous to find out. Also, you'll have guardianship. If there's minor children and they were given land, there'll have to be a guardian appointed. And who are guardians? Those are your associates. Those are generally family members or close friends. And so those can be good clues to researching an individual when you may not have known very much about him. He could become part of your fan club. You're also going to find out about how much money he actually had and what kind of land he had. I've seen wills where it talks about the original person who bought the land and then it came to the individual. So you never know what you're going to find. It's always so fun when I find a will and I start reading it because I have found so many surprises in them. Also, you might just find something about their occupation or their religion or military service. So you can have just really basic wills or you can have some really interesting ones. And we've got a couple fun ones to share with you today.
So, where can you find probate? You're probably wondering, why haven't I found a lot of probate records or estate files for my ancestors? Some of those are only available on FamilySearch digitized microfilm, but there are a lot of resources to help you find them. So let's go through all the different places that you can look to find the probate records for your ancestors. We recommend starting at the FamilySearch Research Wiki because in the United States, probate records are kept at the local level. So you'll want to start off with the county where you think your ancestor died and search for that location and the words probate records in the FamilySearch Wiki. And that will bring up a page about probate records for whatever county you searched for. And if you live in that area, you can go to the county courthouse and look at the will books there. But before you do that, make sure you call ahead to plan a trip and make sure that they're going to be open at the time you're coming, and make sure they have the will books there, because sometimes the probate and will collections have been moved to the state archives. So you never know. And you should always check the collections before you go. So start at the FamilySearch Wiki. If you live close, you can try to go to the county courthouse or the state archives. But most of the time, you're not going to live nearby the records that you're seeking. And so you'll want to look in the 2 online collections, Ancestry's probate indexes by state, and then FamilySearch's digitized microfilms by county. So starting with the indexes, if you go to Ancestry, they have collections for probate records by state. So this is a helpful way to find out which county your ancestor might have died in. If you're not sure, you can just go to the state where you think they died and then search the whole collection of probate and then find if there was any probate for that individual. Although sometimes you might not find your relative in that collection, so you'll still want to go to the FamilySearch digitized microfilms from the specific counties that you think the ancestor died in, because sometimes they were missed in the index. But if you do find them in the Ancestry index, then you can go ahead and take that information and find the exact county in FamilySearch and find more images there. So you never know what you're going to find exactly on Ancestry, so search there first since they have good indexes, and then once you've done that, you can go to the actual county within FamilySearch. So the way you do that is by going to the FamilySearch Catalog, and you type in the name of the county where your ancestor lived, but don't type in the word county, just type in the name of the county. So instead of typing Russell County, Alabama, you just type Russell, Alabama. And that's just how the catalog is. It doesn't like it when you put in the word county. After you type that in, then you'll see a list of all the record types in that county, and you'll see probate. So go down to the probate section and click on it, and then you'll see maybe some books about probate, but you're going to want to look for the collection where the author is the county probate court, or just the name of the county. So that will take you to a page with all of the will books and probate files and the microfilm numbers, and you can click on those camera images next to those listings and then view all of the digitized pages of that book. And you can look through each of those pages, and sometimes at the beginning of the will books, they will have an index for that book. So if you didn't find your ancestor in the Ancestry indexes, you can look in the specific will books for each county and look in the indexes there. So is that how you find the probate, Diana?
Yes, I start with Ancestry with the index because sometimes you get lucky and there is your guy and it has the will right there. It's really easy. But then sometimes it's a little bit trickier. So if you're not finding your person indexed, then I always go to the FamilySearch, like you were saying, the collections on the county level, and look at the indexes myself, because sometimes things get missed. Also on Ancestry, when you're looking at those collections, there's always a little tab to the left, I believe, that says learn more about this collection. If you click on that and then click on the county, it will show you what they have. And perhaps the reason your ancestor is not showing up because they only have like one set of books for your county, and it's not even for the time period that you're looking in. That's just a little hint for using any kind of a collection online. See if you can learn what's actually included in that index to make sure it's giving you the coverage you need. So one of the examples that we're going to talk about today is the case study of Thomas Porch. And this was a client project I had several months ago, and the client wanted to extend the ancestry of this ancestor, and her name was Sarah Porch, I believe. And I had found Thomas on some census records. I'd found him in 1860 in Chariton County, Missouri, but he was missing in 1870 on the census. However, his children had been put into 2 different households. And so that's kind of a sign, if you see younger children and they're not with their parents, that perhaps their parents had died. So I made the hypothesis that he died between 1860 and 1870, and I checked Ancestry's probate, and there he was. There was Thomas Porch. Now, the interesting thing was, with this collection, all I got a link to was the actual index. So the index gave me 6 different references. It referenced 6 different pages in the will book and various books, but Ancestry only led me to the index. So it was up to me to then go find all 6 different entries. And so I did that. The first thing I did was I wrote down each page number, and then I started going through the book, because luckily the index was at the beginning and I could just scroll through and find the page numbers. And then, wouldn't you know it, the page that I really, really needed, that was titled in the index, The Heirs of Thomas Porch, that was missing. So I was looking for page 729, and the microfilm skipped. It went from 727 to 730. So I'm thinking, okay, is this also missing on FamilySearch? Is this the exact same microfilm? So I hopped over to FamilySearch. It was the exact same microfilm, and the missing page was still missing. So I looked up the county courthouse. I used the FamilySearch Wiki, which gave me the phone number, and I called the Chariton County Courthouse, and they sent me over to the circuit clerk, who was over probate. And the clerk was so nice. I love it when people are just so helpful. She took down my information and my phone number, and then she called me back in just a few minutes, and she thought she had found the right book. So we kind of compared the names on the page that I was looking at, 727, and it was the right book. And she took a picture with her cell phone and texted it to me. So literally within 30 minutes, I had a photograph of the actual book, and it had the 4 children that I needed, including the person I was researching, which was great evidence for my client that this was the father of Sarah Porch. Thomas was the person. So you'll see that I had to do quite a bit of digging. If I had just gone to Ancestry and just looking at the index, I would not have found the proof I needed. I had to dig in, and I was rewarded with good information.
That was very lucky and very fun that you were able to call and get the information you needed. The one time that I tried that, I called a repository and they were not helpful at all. It was really tough, but it was like a statewide archive and they just didn't want to look at the death certificate that I needed. The one they had sent me had been covered up with a piece of paper, and so the information I needed was under the piece of paper, and I wanted them to take that paper off and tell me what was under it. But I don't think that the form underneath was filled out all the way, so maybe it was just blank underneath. But I'm so glad that you were able to get success by calling the county courthouse. That's so neat. All right, so let's talk about, what do you do when you find a probate record? So you found that record of Thomas Porch and it had the proof you needed, but sometimes it's more than just one page and you have like 50 or 75 pages. So let's kind of talk about the steps that we do when we find a probate file. The first thing to do is record each search that you have done in your research log, because like Diana said, you might be searching in a few different places. On Ancestry, on FamilySearch, you might be searching through several images in an index of a will book and then looking through the rest of the will book. So you'll want to know each image that you're looking at in your research log so that you can remember where you've looked and what you found on those pages. Then also, you'll want to create a source citation to note exactly which microfilm you viewed, the page number, the image number, and include a link in your research log to that image so that you can access the full image later. But also, not just the link, but you should download the images or image to your computer and then file it in your electronic filing system. What I usually do if I have several images is create a folder titled Probate of whoever, and then I put all the 75 images into that folder. And each image is labeled image 1, image 2, image 3, just the way that I downloaded it from FamilySearch or from the website, so that I know the order that it came in. Then after you name all your files, you can keep working on your citation and your research log. Each image will have a separate citation, which is a lot of work. What do you do, Diana? Do you create a separate citation for each page, or do you just wait until see what you use in the report and then create citations for those?
Yes, that's exactly what I do. Because my Thomas B. Royston's estate file, I believe, was 48 pages. So what I like to do is start a Google Doc, and I will transcribe each page. And so I will do something like in bold at the top of that, image 1, if I'm looking at it off of microfilm. and then I will transcribe it. And my research log can basically say something like, the estate file. In this case, it was an estate file, and it just had several images within that. And I just put in my citation all the information I would need to get to that estate file. Then when I wrote my report, I really only used about maybe 4 of the 48 pages for proof. And so then I just created a specific citation for those pages, the ones that I used in my report. So that's the way I handle that, because I don't see a point for having 48 entries in my research log, page 1, page 2, page 3. Instead, I use the Google Doc to tell me what's on each one of the pages, and I have a general citation. Then when I go to write the report, I can pick out the information and create a citation just for that fact. So for instance, there was a final settlement page that listed all the heirs and their residences. And so I used that specific page. And then also in Thomas B. Royston's case file, his date of death was actually given, which you don't see very often. But when his widow Cynthia went in to start the probate proceedings, it clearly says Thomas B. Royston died 21 September, I think it was 1868, which was great because guess what? His headstone says September 2nd, 1868. So what's going to be better evidence? The headstone, which was really getting old and weathered, or the probate where she is clearly stating in court that he died. And I think that she went in like 2 or 3 days after. So it was pretty quick, right after his death.
I think that's good because when they go into court, that means they're going to start the process of selling stuff, right? So that they can pay off the debts and begin the estate settlement.
Right. They just realized the importance of going in and getting the ball rolling.
Right. So that's really good information. It's much more accurate than the headstone would be.
It is. And I had to address that because you can't just say, well, he either died this day or that day. You have to choose. Which one do you think is better evidence? And that's where the research analysis process comes down to it. What's the original source? What is direct evidence, primary information? We have to really look at those kind of things to help us choose the best source. So after you have got this Google Doc and you've got everything transcribed, and I've just got to make a note here that you may not want to transcribe all the documents, but if you don't, you're not going to be doing reasonably exhaustive research because sometimes it's when I'm transcribing something that I find the little piece of information that I maybe had skipped over. So you're just going to want to do it. You get faster and faster as you do it. One little tip to transcribing is that I always start a new line with the same line of the document. So, I don't let it all run together. Each line corresponds to the line of the original. And that kind of helps me to keep track of where I'm at in the document. And, you transcribe doing everything exactly what you see. You don't try to correct spellings or try to correct information. You just are transcribing what you see. Now, after I've got that all done, I like to make a table. Sometimes your estate file comes in out of order. For whatever reason, when they were microfilming it or when it was put in that file, you've got dates all over the place. So I like to make a mini timeline of that probate, put it in a table and have the date, have a little synopsis of what was found there. And then that is how I really can analyze that probate and see what evidence I can pull from it for my case. So that is what I have learned that makes it so much easier to use this probate. So one other thing to think about is that when we are looking at a will, we have to be careful about making assumptions. We're going to talk a little bit more about this as we talk about how to use the info as evidence. But sometimes you might have somebody named as a cousin, and you have to just know that back in the day, they maybe didn't know exactly the specific relationships that people were to them, but they just knew they were kin. And so you can't look at it and say, okay, I've got to figure out exactly who this is because he's a cousin. Well, maybe it was a niece or a nephew or aunt or an uncle that happened to be the same age, and they just called him a cousin. So just a little caveat there to be sort of careful about relationships. And it could be the same thing with a son or a daughter. Maybe it's a son or a daughter, but they've been adopted into the family and they're really a nephew. The parents of the woman died and she took the boy in and she's calling him her son now. So just like nowadays where our relationships can get a little bit sticky, we've got to realize that all these things in the wills need to be backed up with other kind of documents to the best of our ability to have really solid proof. So another thing that we can do, and we love this whole idea of making lists of future research possibilities. So probate records are rich with future research. You'll discover all sorts of different names of individuals or places that they moved to that could be new places to research. And you're going to get those witnesses. Sometimes it's the witnesses of a will that completely solves a case. That's why when we transcribe, we just take all of that information down, because we are going to go back to that probably over and over as we're working through a difficult case.
That is really true about the witnesses, and I'm excited in our next episode, we're going to go through some of our case studies with this and talk about how the witnesses were really helpful in helping me solve a case of a man with a very common name. So that's going to be fun in the next episode. Well, let's talk some more about the different types of estates. So if a person died intestate, that means that they died with no will. And if the individual dies without a will, the property becomes an intestate estate. And that was the case that we talked about before with Thomas Porch. And according to whatever the law was in that state, the estate is usually going to be divided among the heirs. And usually the heirs are the wife and the children. The spouse or the other family member, whoever wants to, can petition the court to administer the estate. So once they begin that process, then the court will appoint people to work on that. So then the other type of estate is if the person died with a will. So what is that like, Diana?
Well, usually we see wills. I mean, that's one of the really common probate things. And usually the wills that we see are formally witnessed. But there's a couple other ones that are really interesting and you may run across in the course of your research. So we'll just briefly talk about them. One is holographic, and this is one that is written and dated entirely in the handwriting of the testator and signed by him. And again, different states have different statutes about this, but this is a will that generally doesn't require a witness. So you may come across one like that. Then the other one is the Nuncupative Will, and this is an oral will, and this is witnessed by two or more persons, and it's usually given in a moment of danger or imminent death. So say someone is dying on a battlefield and they orally tell their friend who's also a soldier and say, I'm going to die. I need to leave all of my estate to my wife or what have you. And the caveat with that is that the witnesses have to get that written down and get that recorded in a court. And usually they have like 6 to 12 days. And every state might be a little bit different, but somebody can't go 2 years out and say, oh, he told me on the battlefield he was giving me all of his property. No, that's not going to fly. Here's a fun example that I came across in doing some research for a client project, I believe. And I had not found a nuncupative will in my own family history research. So it was fun for me to read it and see it. That's what it was. So it says, the nuncupative will of William Miller, deceased, which he repeated in presence of us on the 21st day of November, 1796, in his last illness at his own house in Lincoln County, being in perfect mind and memory, is as follows. He continues on to talk about how these two people, Mary Rock and Michael Oswell, will make oath to the words as follows, that about 15 minutes before William Miller died, he told his Negro man Peter that he had always been a good true slave to him and not to be deceitful to him, and for to stick by him till he was buried, and he had not nary a child in the world, and when he was buried that he was a free man, and that he would give him his brown horse and saddle and bridle and all of his clothes. That was really interesting. So it appears it was his last illness, why he didn't make a proper will earlier, but maybe he was all of a sudden took a sudden turn for the worse. So here he is quickly doing a will at the last minute, and two people witnessed it and took it into court and wrote this whole story down. Anyway, it was fun to see that. The other kind of will that you are probably going to see is the formally witnessed will. And this is one that has to meet the formal requirements of the state. Each state could be a little bit different, but from what I've seen, they're really, really similar. It's kind of fun once you know what you're looking for to actually see this. So you had to have the testator, the person who's writing the will, he's got to sign it. And this is where you'll often see a little signature and that will say his mark, because he couldn't, he wasn't literate, couldn't write, so he just puts his mark there. And then you've got to have the witnesses. So it has to say something like, we witnessed this will, what have you, and then they have to have signed it. And sometimes they'll use their marks if they also cannot write. That kind of tells you that this was a formally witnessed will when you see the signature and you see the witnesses. And generally, this is the kind of will that you're going to see.
Those are the kind of wills that I've usually seen. I guess I have seen a holographic will when I was researching in Louisiana. The man wrote it all himself and signed it himself. So that's interesting. That doesn't require witnesses. Okay, let's talk about the different components of a will. You'll notice that there are a lot of pieces of the will that are the same from one will to the next because they kind of follow the same format with certain pieces of language that are just used in almost all wills. So at the beginning of a will is a preamble, and that's where the testator, the person whose will it is, identifies himself or herself by name, usually giving where they live, talking about where their residence is at that time. And sometimes if it's a woman would be known as a testatrix, and it will often state that she's the wife of, widow of, or daughter of, depending on her marital status. So that can be really helpful if you find a will of a woman. But the preamble just has that language about who they are, where they lived, and then also about their mental status, for example, being of sound mind and judgment, showing basically that they have legal capacity to write a valid will. Then the next thing that you'll usually see in a will is the disposition of the body and soul. And this clause is about their funeral, whether or not they want to be buried in a certain place, or their cremation. Wills before the 19th century often give statements of religious belief and comments as to the disposition of the soul. And we've noticed that in several of the wills that we've been looking at in the 1800s. The next section is usually about payment of debts, just basically a short statement that all just debts be paid before any distributions from the estate are made as required by law.
Well, it's really helpful to know all these different steps. They call it boilerplate language, and they use the same terminology. So if you are looking at a will and it's really pale, really difficult to read, knowing what you're kind of expected to be seeing can really help the words pop out at you. You're like, oh, of course, that says, that he's of sound mind and judgment, because you're expecting that. So it's very helpful to have an idea of what you should be looking for in a will, especially if it can be difficult to read or the handwriting is incredibly bad. That has helped me a lot in deciphering tricky wills. And I just have to throw this in here, this whole idea of the disposition of the body and the soul. Usually that is very vague and nothing super interesting, but I came across one in my last study group project, and it was the will of Georgia Dawson. And I was just reading it kind of with my mouth hanging open. She was talking about how her desire was that the remains of her mother and her stepmother and her two young children be dug up and then buried with her, and then this big slab to be placed over it. And as I was reading, I was like, oh my word, this is so interesting. And it made me think, well, they probably hadn't been dead very long, because I can't imagine. Anyway, that was probably the most interesting section of a will for talking about what to do with the remains that I've ever seen. After they talk about the debts, that's usually pretty simple. They've got to pay all their debts off before anybody gets anything. Then they get into the interesting stuff, and this is where they're bequeathing all their property. And this is what I love to read and see who gets what, because this is where we get our big clues for relationships. And sometimes you're going to see somebody getting $1 because they were already given all their inheritance. And then, you got to go try to find a land record or something. And sometimes there is no record for that other inheritance. But you can see all sorts of interesting things on these bequeaths. So then we have the residuary distribution, which is a really big term for just saying who gets what when we're all done with the estate. So usually the spouse gets everything else. After the children get their thing and the debts are paid, then the spouse will get everything else in the estate. But sometimes you get other things, sometimes you'll get a clue that at the end, that everything that's left over is going to be divided up among these certain children. So there can be some interesting things there that happen. And that's just called the residue, what is left after everything's been given out.
The next section that you'll see in the will is the naming of the executors. The executor or executrix, if female, is basically just the person who's in charge of handling the distributions and all of that. So they're appointed by the court or authorized to handle all of the affairs of the decedent, the person who died. And this is usually a son or a trusted friend. It could be a brother, a wife, or her brother might be named to serve if she or her family has assets and interests to protect. Often during this part of the will, when they're naming the executors, there will be some information about the legal requirement for the executor to post a bond during the court administration, or it could be waived. So sometimes we'll be talking about that. But it is helpful to see who was named as the executor, because usually that person still resides in the same county where the person died. And in a recent project that I just did, some of the older sons had already moved away and they had already been given their inheritances. So they were named in the will, but they weren't executors. Some of the middle-aged sons were the executors because they still lived closer to the area. So that was interesting. Another section that could be included here is the guardian appointment for minors. If the person who died had minor children, then most states do not allow for a distribution of property to them. So there has to be a guardian appointed, and the testator would name the person he wanted to serve in that capacity. And often the language does not specifically say that they are a guardian, but it does provide that the decisions are to be made by an older brother or child, or a specific child who is a minor. In a recent will that I looked at, it talked about one of the boys was not 16 yet, but the will was not to be distributed until that boy reached 16 years old. So that was kind of the section of the will about the minors. The next section that might be included is the revocation of previous wills and codicils. This is just a standard boilerplate language type of thing to revoke all prior wills. And doesn't mean that there are prior wills, but it's just a precautionary way to say this is the most current will. And sometimes this is even in the preamble of the will. And then the last part that you'll probably see is the execution clause, and this contains the signature of the testator and the witnesses, and usually saying the circumstances around the signing of the will to show that it was signed in a valid way and that the witnesses were present and that kind of thing. All right. Whew, we went through all the parts of the will. That was a lot.
It is a lot, and you might be thinking, oh my goodness, that's just way too much. But it's kind of fun to take a will apart and look for all these things. I've written a blog post about this. So, if you really want to dig into probate, get a will out and then go through and, you can use the blog post to give you all those different sections, because I really don't expect anybody listening to remember all those things we talked about. Basically, we're giving you an introduction here and saying, hey, go look for this in your wills, because the more you understand about how they're written, the better a researcher you're going to be. Let's get to the fun stuff. Using these wills as evidence. How can we use these to prove our points with our research? So one of the things that you have to remember is that they don't necessarily list all the family members. They can, but they don't have to. And a really great example of this is that will of Thomas B. Royston that I referenced. So he has a will. He's the one that has the 48-page case estate file. In his will, he only mentions 3 children and 1 grandson. And guess what? He actually had 14 children, and he had several more grandchildren by the making of his will in 1867. So why did he not list all 14 children? This can be one of those things that you're so frustrated with. Well, he gives a good clue in his will. He says, after my children which are now unmarried and minors be made equal with my children which are married. So that gives us a clue. He's got younger children and he's got married children. So maybe he already gave an inheritance to his married children. He had a large plantation there in Alabama. He had a lot of land. I do have a land record where he gave some land to one of his daughter's husbands soon after their marriage. So maybe he considered that her inheritance. And his minor children were Possibly he didn't want to do anything with them because they were still too little. I think the youngest one was only 3. I had to really take into account the entire family, everything I had learned about the family, and trying to understand more about his probate and his estate. And he had another clause in his will that the estate would not be finalized until the youngest child had either married or come of age. So when would that have been? She was 1867. She was about 3. This was not going to be for a long time. This is going to be way out. And in fact, the final settlement, I believe, is dated 1882. It might be 83. So you can look for some little clues in there that there's going to be more probate later on. Sometimes it's years later when everybody's finally grown up and they can finish doing the distribution of all the estate. A will is not an end-all. It basically is something that you're going to use as evidence in conjunction with other records with this family as a whole. So it's really good, like we said before, to look for some future research and see if there's some other family members that maybe are mentioned that you could do some more research on. So one of the wills, the one about Georgia Dawson, who wanted to have the remains of the children, dug up and buried with her, she had left this great will, but I was trying to figure out who her father was. And in her estate packet, it showed that her estate sale was held at the home of this Noland Lewis. So that was a clue that this was probably someone close to her. And then she also talks about her brother, who was Owen Lewis. So, I'm figuring out Lewis is her maiden name. And then she mentions all these other Lewis men who are probably her brothers, but that's not named in any of her will. She names her sisters, but not her brothers. So I found another will of a Dawson in the county, hoping it was her father, but it wasn't. And he was a cousin because he mentioned his uncle, Nolan Lewis, and then his cousin, Jacob Lewis. So here I have all these Lewises floating around and trying to map them out, figure out their relationships to Georgia. So just know you're going to find all this fun evidence of names and relatives, but then it's up to you to figure out who they all are.
And it usually creates a lot of extra research to do, but that's what we're going to talk about in the next episode, is how we use the evidence in these wills and probates that we found to make connections and find the answers to research questions. So I'm excited about that. So what do you do when you get a will that doesn't have a lot of relationships listed, maybe is really short or has a lot of inconclusive information? That can be frustrating. You might discover a will that has no heirs really, or just maybe the person didn't list the heirs. You never know what you'll find, but often you will find things like that. Then it's up to you to kind of use the indirect evidence there to put the records together and try to find alternative sources like land or tax records. Just keep in mind, though, that an individual may leave property not only to their children and grandchildren, but nieces, nephews, and friends. So be careful about making assumptions. You might just want to keep an open mind the first time you look at a will that the people listed as heirs might be relatives beyond just the immediate family. And this is just the same thing that you would do in a census record, just to be careful that you don't assume that the wife named is the mother of the children, because it could be a second or third wife. So just be careful when you're reading these wills and probate records that you don't make assumptions, but that you definitely transcribe every record and take into account every little clue that you come across. All right, well, that covers everything that we wanted to talk about today. In our next episode, we're going to dive into a few different case studies of how we actually found certain probate files and wills and how we use them to prove parentage and prove different things that we were looking for. So we invite you to come and listen again next week as we go through that. And don't forget that we have a freebie for you, our probate cheat sheet, and the link is in the show notes. So go and download that now, and you guys can have some extra help on finding those probate records that are so helpful to your genealogy research. So thanks for listening.
All right, bye-bye. We'll see all of you next time.
Thank you for listening to Research Like a Pro with Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional, and Nicole Dyer. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your own genealogy research. If you like what you heard, please leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher, or visit our website, familylocket.com, to contact us. You can find our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.